Welcome to this tutorial on using ConfigMaps in Kubernetes. In this video, we'll explore how to inject configuration data into your pods using two powerful methods, environment variables and volume mounts. ConfigMaps are essential tools for managing application configuration in a cloud-native environment. Let's dive in and learn how to master these techniques. A config map is a Kubernetes object that stores configuration data as key-value pairs. Think of it as a dictionary that holds settings your applications need to run. The main benefit of config maps is that they decouple configuration from your container images. This means you can change settings without rebuilding your containers. It also makes your applications portable and reusable across different environments, like development, testing, and production. Each environment can have its own config map with appropriate settings. Kubernetes provides two primary methods for injecting config map data into pods. The first method uses environment variables. With this approach, config map values are injected as environment variables that your application can access directly within the container. The second method uses volume mounts. Here, config map data is mounted as files in the container's file system. Your application reads these files to get configuration values. Both methods have their use cases, and choosing between them depends on your application's needs and how it reads configuration data. Let's look at how to create a config map. The structure is straightforward. You start with the standard API version v1 and specify the kind as config map. In the metadata section, you give it a name. Here we're using app-config. The data section is where you define your key-value pairs. In this example, we have three keys: database_URL with a value pointing to a Postgres database, log_level set to info, and max_connections set to 100 as a string. Remember, all config map values are stored as strings. Now let's see how to inject config map values as environment variables. The first approach is to inject individual keys one at a time. Under the env section of your container specification, you define each environment variable. For example, to inject database_URL, you specify the name and then use value_from with config map key ref. This tells Kubernetes to pull the value from a config map. You provide the config map name, which is app-config, and the specific key you want to use. You repeat this pattern for each key you need, such as log_level. This method gives you fine-grained control over which config map keys become environment variables. If you want to inject all keys from a config map at once, Kubernetes provides a simpler approach using envFrom. Instead of defining each environment variable individually, you use the config map ref directive. You simply specify the name of the config map, in this case, app-config. Kubernetes will automatically create environment variables for every key-value pair in that config map. This is much more convenient when you have many configuration values and want them all available as environment variables. The key names from the config map become the environment variable names. The second method for injecting config map data is through volume mounts. This approach mounts the config map as files in your container's file system. First, you define a volume in the volumes section of your pod specification. You give it a name, like config-volume, and specify that it comes from a config map by providing the config map name. Then, in your container's volume mount section, you reference that volume by name and specify where to mount it using mount path. In this example, we're mounting it to /etc/config. Each key in the config map becomes a file in that directory, with the key as the file name and the value as the file content. Here's a complete example of a pod that uses a config map. We define a pod with API version v1 and kind pod. In the metadata, we name it myapp-pod. The spec section defines the containers. We have one container named myapp using the Nginx image. To inject all config map values as environment variables, we use envFrom with config map ref pointing to our app-config config map. When this pod starts, all the configuration values from the config map will be available as environment variables inside the container. This makes it easy for your application to access configuration data without any hard-coded values.
If you like this video, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. Visit codelucky.com for more such useful content.